Welcome to Make It Sew, a beginner sewing series by SureFit Designs. I'm Glenda, sometimes referred to as Glenda the Good Stitch. In Make It Sew, I've been covering a number of different techniques that you might want to know as a beginner seamstress. In today's video, I'm going to talk about buttonholes. And so we're going to begin by taking a look at how to actually put a buttonhole on the machine, or how to put a buttonhole on with your machine. Years ago, we used to have a very clunky attachment that went onto the machine that sewed the buttonhole for us. Now machines have specialized feet where they actually sew the buttonhole. And some of them that I've seen have something or other at the end of the foot where you can actually set the button in, and that automatically sends a signal to the machine of how long to sew the buttonhole. Mine doesn't do that, and so I need to manually know the length and the width of my button, or shall I say the length and the thickness of my button. And if you buy buttons that are on cards like this, when you turn the card over, you'll see that this says that it's 16 millimeters wide. And in this one, as I look at this one, it's 18 millimeters. But sometimes we buy buttons that aren't on cards, and it's just a little package like this. And that's what I'm going to use on this blouse that I've been working on. And I'm going to use this small peach-colored button. I think that that will look pretty on that fabric. But how do you know how wide it is? Well, just take your seam gauge and start measuring. And because my buttonhole stitches in millimeters, I do need to measure this in millimeters, and it is 15 millimeters wide. And then you need to consider the thickness of the button. And this is a very, very thin button, so I'll give another millimeter for that. So we're going to call it 16 millimeters. And typically, when you sew a buttonhole, you also have to allow for where the button sits and the shank on the button. So I know from my machine that I have to do it at least 2 millimeters longer. So I would make this buttonhole 18 millimeters long. Now, as I said at the beginning, all machines are going to be different. So please make sure you reference your instruction manual for your sewing machine. I have a number of different buttonhole options that are pre-programmed in my machine. I typically just use the standard buttonhole, but again, you'll want to experiment with these. The thing that you'll want to do before you start any buttonhole stitching on your actual garment is do a sample, or 2 or 3, because you need to make sure that you're confident before you start stitching on your actual project. You want to make sure that you set your sample project up, or your sample up, exactly like your garment is prepared. So in this blouse, we've got the right side, we've got another layer of fabric here, the inside being the facing, and it has been interfaced. So you'll want to do exactly the same thing on your sample. So here I've got it set up. As we look inside, there's my interfacing. So this would be the facing, and there's the right side. You'll want to do it exactly on the fabric you're working with. In other words, if you were working on a silk blouse, it would be of no benefit at all to set up your sample on a piece of cotton. You've got to use the exact same fabric to do this. And then you'll also notice that I've got this marked. And again, this would be as if it was the inside of my garment. And I've got it all marked because I want to know exactly where center front is, and I also need to know that little bit of thickness that the buttonhole is going to have once it gets sewn. So as we take a look, I'll just hold the buttonhole this way, you can see that there's a bar tack at the top and at the bottom. Well, that uses up thickness, and I want my button to sit right on center front. So it means I have to allow for that bar tack on the inside edge. Well, I guess it depends how you're looking at this. If it was sitting like this, it's the outside edge. So it means that I'm likely going to start my buttonhole right where I've done my cross mark, that T. But I'm going to test it and make sure. And so this is all stabilized. But before I do this, if you're working on a really stretchy fabric like a knit and you want to get a buttonhole in, once you've done your sample and if it just is stretching way out of shape, I wanted to show you these options as well. This is a tearaway stabilizer, and this is another one called Stitch in the Ditch Stabilizer. You can actually put this stabilizer over top of your fabric or underneath. It depends which is the best way that you sew the buttons, from the right or the wrong side, the buttonholes I meant to say. And then afterward, all you do is tear this away. So this really helps to stabilize as well. Okay, so now I've got my machine set on my stitch pattern number 40, which is my standard buttonhole, and I'm just going to remove the regular machine foot, and I'm going to put on the buttonhole foot, and I'm just threading the thread, the top thread, down through that little eye, or that little space where the stitching is going to happen, so that my threads are both underneath the presser foot. And then, because I've got it all set up on 18 millimeters long, I'm going to start on my sample, and I'm going to set the needle right on that cross mark, that T mark that I've set up. And I'm going to lower the presser foot, and then I'll just begin sewing. Because it's all automated, the machine's going to take over from here. And you really don't need to guide it. You don't need to force it through. You just let it go naturally. I've learned over the years that my machine sews a buttonhole best if I do it from the inside or the wrong side of the garment. And so that's why you're seeing it set up the way that it is. And once it's sewn one buttonhole like this, it remembers the program. And so it's really easy. I don't need to make any changes to this. Let's just clip those threads, and there you can see that that buttonhole is completely finished. Now I started a little bit off my blue T mark there, and so it just depends where that button's going to sit. I actually think, because of the bar tack, that I need to go a little bit closer to that T. So I'm actually starting the stitching about 1/8 of an inch away from my center front marking. And that's why you need to do a couple of samples like this, to make sure you're getting your buttonhole positioned exactly where you want it to be on your garment. I'm just going to clip these threads here. Sometimes I'd pull them from one side to the other and tie them off. And you can see that that one ended up with a little bubble of thread there. Needless to say, I'd have to trim that off and be really careful. The first one I stitched didn't have that bubble of thread. And that can happen. It just depends how smoothly your threads are pulled off to the underside of your sewing machine. And now I'd like to show you a couple of ways to cut this buttonhole open. Just remove those threads, and then we'll see which one actually sits the best. The process that I like the best to cut a buttonhole open is to use one of these buttonhole cutters. And I've got a couple of different samples here for you to see. They're a very narrow blade. This is about 3/8 of an inch wide, but the end of the blade is beveled. I hope that you can see that. It's a really, really sharp beveled edge. And you saw me take them out of their covering sheath. I always make sure that they go back in there because you want these blades to stay very, very nice and sharp. And they usually come with a little block of wood. So you're going to take your buttonhole that you've just made and cut it open using that blade like this. And it usually makes a nice clean cut, and I didn't press down quite hard enough to cut the fibers. Let's see if that did it. There we go. So now I've got a nice clean cut there. If you don't have a little buttonhole cutter like this, another way to do it is to actually put a straight pin at the end of where the bar tack is. And there's a lot of fabric there, so there's a lot of thread there. And that's to prevent clipping beyond it. So you can either use little nippers and go in here and nip in between the rows of the stitching, or you can take a seam ripper and just rip up to that needle, to the pin. I personally don't like that technique because I always feel like I'm going to go beyond and cut my bar tack. I much prefer the buttonhole cutter and the little block. But one way or the other, that's how you get them open. And then you want to make sure that your button is going to sit exactly where you want it to go, and that the size of buttonhole is correct. So as I push that button through, it's fitting perfectly. And let's see when I put it through this one. And that could maybe be that I just need to cut it open a little bit more, because that was the one that I did with the seam ripper and I was afraid of going too far. Now, if this is sitting at the center front, that second buttonhole that I did is actually the better one. It starts a little bit into the seam allowance here, or the center front allowance, the button extension allowance is what I wanted to say. So this one, let's see, this would sit right here, and that's good. You need to give the position for that bar tacking, you need to give it some space in this button extension so that when you do get the button sewn on, that the button will sit exactly at the center front. And obviously I've used a contrasting color of thread so that you could see what I was doing. In order to actually finish off this, the buttonholes on this blouse, what I would do now is change the color of my thread and do them permanently. And in this sample, I did mark this all with a blue washable marking pen. Typically, what I'll do when I'm ready to sew the buttonholes is I'll just mark each buttonhole location with pins, knowing that the buttonhole extension was drawn for the specific width of the button that I've planned on using. Directions for this are found on page 22 of the dress kit instruction book. So once the location has been marked with pins, I'll go and take that and set this into the sewing machine and lower the needle right down where that particular straight pin is, and then just sew the buttonhole as I've shown you. But as I said at the beginning of this lesson, everybody's machine is going to be different in how you stitch a buttonhole. So please make sure that you test your machine, do 3 or 4 or 5 samples, how many ever you need to, add stabilizer if you need to, and build your confidence in sewing a buttonhole before you actually start putting it onto your finished garment. There is one last thing before I close off this video completely that I'd like to mention to you about stabilizing the stitching on your buttonholes, and that is that you can actually use fray check on the edge of your buttonhole to make sure that those little threads aren't going to come apart or fray, and you just put a little dab on. And when I say a little dab, I really do mean a little dab will do you. It's just a very, very tiny amount. But again, please make sure that if you're going to experiment with fray check, that you do it on a sample piece, because in some fabrics, the fray check will actually leave a mark. So with that, we'll now officially close, and in the next video I will show you a very easy way to stitch on a button. If you've enjoyed this video, and I certainly hope that you have, I invite you to join the Sure-Fit Designs community, and you can do that in 3 easy steps. Number 1, just go on over to surefitdesigns.com and subscribe to the newsletter, and when you do, you're going to receive free getting started gifts. Number 2, you're likely in YouTube watching this right now. Please make sure you subscribe to my YouTube channel and like this video. And there's buttons below the video to do both of those things. And also, we now have a Facebook user group. And all you need to do is go to facebook.com/SureFitDesigns. On the left-hand side, where all the links are shown, it says Groups and Sure-Fit Designs. Go ahead and ask to join, and we will approve you right away. We have people from all over the world interacting with one another, sharing the garments they've made with Sure-Fit Designs and asking questions. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope to see you next time.